Welcome to the High Strangeness Factor. As you can probably guess, I'm not Steve Ward. I'm actually Andy Mercer. He is sometimes co-host and producer of the show. Unfortunately, Steve wasn't available this week to record a show, so he left it to me to create something. This is an old recording I made a few years ago with a good friend of mine, Richard Ward, where we talked about voodoo, its history and its practice. And I thought it'd be quite nice to have a re-listen to this show. I say it was recorded about 3 or 4 years ago, and I have better audio recording equipment than I had in those days, so the sound quality is not as brilliant as it could be, but at least I think it's certainly listenable. Anyway, Steve will be back for the next show, but for this week you have me, my friend Richard Ward, no relation to Steve by the way, just a coincidence of names, where we talk about the history and practice of voodoo. Hope you enjoy. I'm here with my good friend Richard. We're going to be talking about aspects of voodoo today for the new show. This is a pre-record I did a little while ago with Richard in his flat in a part of Essex, which is quite warm at the moment, so we're slightly melted here. But generally speaking, it's been quite an interesting day. But Richard, just for those who may not have heard the previous show you did with me a few months ago, would you mind just introducing yourself again?
My name is Richard Ward. I would describe myself as an occultist and psychic quester and researcher who is over the past 30 plus years looked into a wide variety of psychic phenomena, ghosts and the supernatural, magic and most aspects of the occultism and alternative religions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely very interesting life you've led so far.
I like to think so.
Definitely. Also, I think your occupation is something that's quite interesting in itself. It all kind of links in together.
Yes, I sell second-hand books on the occult and related subjects, so that kind of ties in with my own personal interests as well.
I'm just going to advertising for Richard. It's manmythandmagic.com, which you can find on the internet. So manmythandmagic.com for second-hand books on the occult and the esoteric. But of course, both of us have a wide range of interests in the occult, but I think you said, probably that the core, or at least one of the cores, if you like, of your interest, of course, is voodoo.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Which is, I think, probably quite unusual for, let's be honest, a white English chap to have an interest in that particular form of magic. So how did that come about?
I first heard of voodoo, actually, from my father when I was a teenager. He was talking to me about a book he'd read, and it all seemed very, very sort of quite dark and quite scary at the time, and something that I probably then didn't ever anticipate actually working with practically, but it did fascinate me enough to want to look into it more. And then in the mid-1990s, I think it was 1996, with a friend who was an initiate of Santeria, or Lakumi as it's also known, I was introduced to the Warriors, which is one of the first stages within Lakumi initiation, but the strangeness that surrounded that in dreams and visions and things like that seemed to indicate to him that voodoo, from a Haitian perspective or Afro-Haitian perspective, was more where I was being led. And that was kind of the start of the story. And then I met my current godfather in 2002, who was initiated in Jacmel in Haiti.
Okay, that's interesting. There's a few terms which, personally, I'm quite familiar with, but I'm sure our general listeners have probably never heard of before. What is Santeria specifically then?
Santeria is an Afro-Cuban originally system of religion and magic, which is, like voodoo itself, is derived from various traditions in Africa. Although the traditions of Lakumi, or Santeria as it's also known, are mainly derived from the traditions of Nigeria and the Yoruba peoples, which is then undergone, as many of the Afro Caribbean religions have, various other systems have kind of been grafted into it as it's sort of spread, including a lot of European Freemasonry. When it went to America, there's been lots of incorporations there with Native American magic and also native magic wherever it's gone, really. But they are all African systems originally.
Oh, okay, so that's where it's all drawn. And so we're talking about, obviously, sort of folk religion of the area.
We are really, yes, which is, and they're all commonly based around sort of ancestral practices within nature, in that the various spirits are usually ancestral in origin, but manifest through the natural world, through places like some of them dwell in trees, some of them dwell in lakes, ponds, rivers, the sea, etc.
Is there a particular, like a central text that relates to various forms of voodoo? That's like a Bible.
No, it is primarily an oral tradition.
Okay.
And although there have been several books written historically on voodoo, the first, which was written at the end of the 18th century by a guy called Moreau de St Mary, who gave the first written account in the Western world of an actual voodoo ritual that he witnessed when he was in Haiti, and that was probably took place around about 1760, 1770, something like that.
Whereabouts was that?
He doesn't. It was in Haiti, but he doesn't actually. And it's probably was in northern Haiti, from all of the evidence surrounding that, because voodoo was actually outlawed in Haiti when it was taken there from Africa by the slaves. Because it was one of the forces which actually engendered the Haitian Revolution and resulted in the uprising of the slaves overthrowing their white masters, and the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere was thus established in 1804.
That's interesting. Of course, that's makes it pretty much unique in that respect, that they overthrew and remained overthrown, as it were, and continues as an independent nation. As many of them are now, of course, independent, but this is the first to say that basically threw off their colonial masters, as it were.
Yeah, threw off their shackles, literally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. One thing that I think is interesting, of course, is that voodoo is like a broad coverall term, isn't it, for a number of different practices and faiths?
It is now. It wasn't always so. I mean, the word voodoo itself comes from the language of the Fon people of Dahomey, and their practices were sort of centred around the town of Arada. Hence, when you look at Haitian voodoo, there are various different streams of Haitian voodoo, but the two most popular are Rada, which is named after the town of Arada that I just mentioned, and that Fon word voodoo just means spirit, or rather spirit of the place, because it really kind of indicates an ancestral presence through nature, as I've already mentioned.
That's absolutely fascinating, particularly the whole idea of the spirit of place is something you've seen in various folk faiths around the world, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very, very common theme.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are other names of other types, isn't there? Other kinds of voodoo practices, if you like, under that kind of coveralty that the general populace understand. What are the different ones that are around?
There are. I mean, when voodoo spread to Haiti, as I say, you have the Rada practice is known, which is derived from the Fon peoples of Dahomey chiefly, so from Dahomean spirits. Then you have what's known as Petro, which is, the actual name is difficult to tie down its origins, but it's probably comes from a line of Congolese kings, because it's a more aggressive form of voodoo in the sense that the spirits are more aggressive to work with. And that is the other main strain of voodoo in Haiti. But then you have various other practices. There's the Nago practice within voodoo, which stems from the Nigeria or Yoruban practices of Africa. And there are various other smaller sort of spirit groups, which again, most of them are either Dahomean, Yoruban or Congolese in an origin. And when I say Congolese, also it's important to remember that the Congolese Empire used to incorporate parts of Angola and various other neighbouring states. It was far wider spread than the modern day Democratic Republic of Congo as we know today in Africa.
So what kind of time frame was that in existence, you like, the empire?
You're probably going back to, certainly, it's mutable, but certainly pre the diaspora of the African slaves, which took place from round about the sort of late 17th, sort of early 18th century mainly, although Congolese slaves were really only introduced strongly towards the end of the 18th century, hence the Petro side of voodoo was what was actually responsible for the revolution. It was that farier, sort of more aggressive side, which its magical practices in particular were used to overthrow the European slave masters.
Yeah, interesting. So they're using magic against them.
They did, yes. Yeah, this has been documented, you know, sort of in various books going back, you know, to the 18th century. So,
What kind of, can you say what kind of thing they would actually have done?
There was various things. I mean, one of the main sort of accounts is the use of poisons to sort of, well, poison people, kill people basically, and other various powders, which again, these were probably Congolese in derivation, form part of the Petro cult, and you have various ancestral figures now who have been deified as Loa, or spirits within Haiti, such as figures like Macandal, for example, and various other figures which were famous, you know, sort of root doctors and poisoners, which had brought their practices from Africa, which largely were drawn from a lot of the secret societies in Africa, because there were a lot of secret magical societies both within the Congo and elsewhere in Africa, and it's arguably those practices which gave the operative side, shall we say, to the basis of Haitian voodoo.
So if you were to go back to modern Congo now, is there anything comparable to voodoo from Haitian voodoo? Is it quite a different system? Or the separation over the years has grown differently?
Difficult to say without actually going there, in all honesty. I mean, you can find traces. I mean, there have been quite a few academic texts now published only really within the last 20 years, which have talked about the Congolese origins of Petro in Haiti. But there are, I wouldn't say necessarily in the Congo, but certainly in Haiti there are certain lineages which preserve the original Congo tradition rather than the way it has kind of manifested through Petro, because Petro really is a composite system which has used spirits and magical practices not just from the Congo but from other strains of voodoo as well.
And is there a Christian influence in there because of the...
Yes, there is. I mean, there's the practice of what is known as syncretism, by which the Loa or voodoo spirits are equated with various Catholic saints, which came about in Haiti as a result of the voodoo religion being banned and the slave masters forcing the slaves to attend the Catholic Church. And they saw in a lot of the iconography, just to give one, you know, sort of brief example, you see pictures of St. Patrick. He's usually depicted with snakes around the foot of his pictures, because supposedly, according to legend, he drove all the snakes out of Ireland. And therefore he's been equated with Dambala, the Homian serpent god. And there are various other, you know, sort of similar forms of this iconography. So now it is very, very widespread that Christian icons are used in a lot of peristyles or caves, which are, you know, sort of voodoo temples and houses in Haiti. And that is now a very, very widespread part of it. And also there's been quite a, particularly in the south of the island of Haiti, there's quite an influence from European Freemasonry, which has also brought in certain aspects of what might be termed Christian mysticism within it.
So how did that come about then, the Freemason element coming into the story?
Freemasonry first came to Haiti within the 18th century, and a lot of the esoteric Freemasonry, as it's known, was, you can really look back to a guy called Martinez Pasquale, who visited Haiti and actually died in Port-au-Prince at the end of the 18th century, and set up the first sort of proto-Masonic lodge of his line within a place called Laogan, which is in the south of the island. And that then became particularly not just an influence on voodoo, but an influence on a lot of the structure of the voodoo societies, the secret societies, which again had taken their original origins from Africa. But if you look at the sort of structure of Freemasonry and a lot of the African societies, there's a lot of common ground. So it's in the same way as the syncretism with Catholic saints was adopted by a a lot of voodoo practitioners. The same can be said of European Freemasonry.
So it's quite an amalgam of the influences that came into the area, sort of bringing them in. And so I found it interesting in saying about the adaptation of the Christian and Catholic statues and iconography being that is becoming almost like a disguised way of worshipping as well. You mentioned obviously the term lower a few times. I mean, we can get general sense of what the lower are, but can you say a bit more specifically what are the lower?
Yeah, again, lower is again it's another fond word, literally meaning spirit, which the lower are. They were probably originally, most of the lower were living people at one time, and then they were deified as ancestors because they were sort of priests or diviners, or, you know, in some cases, you know, sort of witches and poisoners even, that were then deified after death and were seen to still manifest their power through the natural world. And various lower are said to inhabit, you know, various parts of that. You've got, for example, Dambala the serpent lower is said to reside in various trees. A lot of different temples within Haiti will have, you know, a large tree as part of that complex where certain spirits are said to reside, just as they often have a pool or bath which is dedicated to certain of the water spirits, like Agwe, who is the Lord of the Seas, and various others. And then you have others which, for instance, Papazaka, who is a lower, which is represents agriculture. So again, it's all of these different sort of ties to the natural world and the land in which the spirits manifest and reside.
How many would you say there were?
It would be impossible, I would say, to actually put a number on the amount of lower that actually exist, because new lower are created all the time.
Interesting.
For example, I mean, McCandle, who was a famous poisoner I mentioned earlier, he has now been deified as a lower, and he's, you know, sort of worshipped by various people, you know, sort of in Haiti, venerated, and there are various other cases of this as well. Plus, the reason it gets very, very complicated is that it's very much dependent on geographical location in Haiti as it was in Africa. There are different forms of the same lower worshipped in the south of the country, but different forms worshipped under slightly different names and variations in the north of the country. And it all depends on where the slaves were originally from when they settled, because a lot of the Congolese slaves were taken to the north of the country. I'll try and give an example. There's Ogun, for example, who is the patron of smiths, metalwork and warriors, which is drawn originally from both the Nago and Yoruban traditions of Africa. But then there are various different Oguns when you get to Haiti, dependent on where they have actually come from. There is an Ogun Badagry, who is named after a place in the Yoruban Empire. Then you also have Ogun Ferai, who is the Iron Ogun, who comes from somewhere else. And there are probably at least 10 or a dozen different Oguns, and the same is also true for the various other spirits. And therefore, considering there has got to be at least probably 50 distinct different spirit types, and then you have all the regional variations, and if you times that up, you've probably got somewhere in excess of 500 different spirits. So as I say, it will be probably impossible to actually tie down a finite number. And as I say, also you have the fact that certain other people, when they pass the spirit world, are deified as lower, and because they might have been a very important Hugun or Mambo, which is a priest or priestess in life, or an important sorcerer, which is known as a Boko, and their powers are seen as being accessible after death, and therefore many of them are actually deified following death. And then, just to complicate matters, there are also other spirits which can actually be created by a Boko or Hugun, which do not form part of ancestral practice, but are known as Loa Travai, which is working spirits which are just put to work for sort of certain purposes. So if you add those on top of the actual Loa Mayor or Major Loa as they're known,
Yeah.
then that extends the total up probably even into thousands eventually.
I suppose it's creating itself to something for a task, then it is an unending number. But you're saying about this kind of lowification, just to remember that word, it's a bit like kind of becoming a saint, I suppose, in Catholicism.
It is, yes, and I mean you'll see the same thing within Lukumi and Santeria, also within the Afro traditions that have gone into Mexico and elsewhere. Certainly, Catholic saints are a big part of the iconography now, which is, and also it's probably worth remembering that Christian missionaries had also influenced certain parts of Africa, including they were in the Congo long before the slaves were actually taken to Haiti. So there was certainly a lot of African exposure to, particularly through obviously the lines of the Jesuit missionaries, that would have exposed them to that sort of iconography even before Voodoo left Africa.
Okay, so I mean, we talk about spirits and all, but it's somewhat of a different conception, isn't it, of the Judeo-Christian sense of spirits, because they tend to be more, or supernatural beings, if you want, like angels and demons, etc. They're kind of almost preset. They've always existed. Whereas this is quite a different system, isn't it?
It is in some ways. The origins of certain Loa can be traced to, as I said before, certain of them people. Certain of them are memories of place as well, of certain sites within Africa which were considered sacred. But it's a difficult thing to actually establish origin in a lot of these cases. So, I mean, to a certain degree, if you went and spoke to practitioners in Haiti, they would say the Loa have always existed. But then you also have now, particularly within the various lines influenced by European Freemasonry and other, sort of non-African, shall we say, traditions, they introduce things like the magic of the European grimoires. And therefore you now have within voodoo magic spirits being taken from various European grimoires, and in some lines in Haiti, Satan or Wa Leslif, as he's known, which is King Lucifer, is actually worshipped as a spirit, for various sort of magical purposes and things like that. So it's been a great conglomerate, really. And then going farther out from that, you now have various Native American spirits which are worshipped as part of American voodoo. And then to complicate matters further, you probably heard the term hoodoo, which is
Funny, I was going to come on to that next, actually. Yeah.
Really the sort of the American term for the operative side of the magical side of voodoo rather than a religion.
I think it's worth mentioning that you can see voodoo as very much a religion as well as being a magical practice, whereas things like the West tend to be very much separated. The idea of
Yes, they do.
And magic.
Yes.
Christianity has been against magic, but there are two sides almost of the same coin here, aren't they?
There are, yes, and I mean certainly with the hoodoo practice, saints and various Loa are still approached to for their help and given offerings in the traditional manner for work done. But they are not the subject of veneration in the same way that these ancestral spirits are in Haiti.
It's interesting. So it's almost like a down and dirty version, if you like, kind of missing some of the higher aspects.
A little bit, yes, and also incorporating, as I say, a lot of American folk magic as well, because even when the African slaves were taken to Haiti, they were quick to realise that there was importance within the native traditions of the island itself, which derived from the Arawak Indians and the later Carib culture that conquered the Arawak, and certain ritual items such as zemi, which are stone fetishes. Some of them are also known as sort of various sort of prehistoric arrowheads and things like this that were made by these peoples, are actually collected as talismanic objects and highly prized by voodoo practitioners, because they realise that as the indigenous people, they would actually have the greatest power over the powers of the land where they're living. So they would take that into account and obviously honour those sort of natural indigenous presences in order to work their own magic more successfully.
All right. I mean, I think if of the United States of America, if you talk about any kind of hoodoo or voodoo, people tend to think of New Orleans as being a kind of at the centre of that. Does that make sense? Is that what you think?
Yes, New Orleans is probably what most people talk about when they talk about American voodoo. I mean, you have various practices within the South, which are not just in sort of New Orleans, but throughout a lot of the southern states like Louisiana and elsewhere. But again, these have also taken on parts of European tradition. There's obviously the Pennsylvania Deutsch rather than Dutch, as it should be known, which is the sort of German traditions known as powwow, which are their folk magic, which were taken into parts of the south of America, particularly among the Ozark peoples in the southern states. And these have also gone into influence American voodoo, and hoodoo to some degree. That in fact, if you look at certain, sort of modern books which have been written on hoodoo, it's quite actually difficult in some cases to recognise the African origins, even though they are there.
Yeah, I suppose the transmogrification and movement and introduction of other ideas, sometimes lose sight of the original origins of things.
Sometimes, yes.
I think you and I have talked about on a previous show about the whole idea of magic, how it sometimes loses its origins and becomes something different. I mean, we've talked before about things like the Wicca, etc., the way that it's kind of adapted lots of ideas that were around and then sort of thrown together to create this kind of quotation new religion, when in actual fact it has elements to trace into other sources that aren't anything like witchcraft. I mean, we talk about things like God's dawn influence, etc. before.
That's very true. Yeah, that is very true. As I say, the Freemasonic traditions are, a case in point for that, really. That's, but I should say that everything that has been adopted, certainly within what I would still say is recognisable as true voodoo traditions, which have their original origins in Africa, have been adopted because of similarities to pre-existing African practice. The Freemasonry, for example, a lot of the structure of the African secret magical societies within the Congo and elsewhere, they probably looked at Freemasonry and thought, yes, we can see similarities here in the symbols, the sacredness of language, of gesture, and various other parts of it, the hierarchy, for example, that would actually be quite familiar to the African mindset. And therefore, I think the introduction of a lot of these non-African influences was because they recognised some kind of similarity that would result in some kind of seamless symbiosis into the systems they'd already got, which would actually make the religion as it travelled easier and more successful to practice, and also the magical side.
So is there like a high priest structure, if you like, to voodoo? Is it something that's sort of structured in that kind of way? Or is it more kind of amorphous?
There is. I mean, there are, within normal houses of voodoo, there are huguns and mambos, which are priests and priestesses.
Is that the name for the temples or houses?
The houses they've got various names. They're sometimes known as Ks, which is just a name for a house. The actual temple building is sometimes known as a humfor.
So I mean, when you say house, is it like a physical building you're talking about?
Yes, it's usually there are separate buildings for different groups of spirits, known as cales or cult buildings.
Right.
And normally that, even if a sort of a voodoo house or tradition might worship various spirits from various parts of Africa now within Haiti, but they will be kept separated. So if a house worships Safari Petro spirits, they will have their own Calais or cult building, which will be separate perhaps to the ancestral spirits of that house, or the Rada spirits, or whichever other spirits they're working with. They will have separate altars, and that's been, sort of traditional in Haiti ever since voodoo has been there, really.
There's one element that we have to mention, which unfortunately I know you're probably not really keen on, but it is probably most people's first experience of voodoo, and of course it's that Bond film, Live and Let Die. What's your opinion of what you saw in that film?
There are some aspects of it which I can see where they've got it from, and others which are clearly not really voodoo derived, such as the dolls in the fields and things that they use. And obviously there's a big sort of emphasis on the calling up of a zombie, which obviously is something which is probably the most well known, sadly, aspect of voodoo is the zombie, which is something I'm sure we'll come on to talk about
Absolutely.
a little bit more. But in general, the Hollywood film industry has not done voodoo any favours, in that most of the depictions of it are very, very biased. They, sort of almost paint it as some sort of very, very dark sort of, black magic type of religion. And I'm afraid Live and Let Die really did sort of kind of go along those lines, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. But obviously there are, sort of better films out there, sort of documentary films made by people like Zora Hurston in the earlier part of the 20th century, which is, I would, suggest if anybody wants to really get an idea about what voodoo is about, that they actually watch that, which I'm sure is probably available on the internet. The only thing I would say is that be warned if you are of a disposition where you do not like to watch images of animal sacrifice, which I should say for the most part is done in a very humane way and is done to not just feed the spirit but to also feed the people as well, but it will contain images of that, I'm afraid. The killing of the animals is done usually, in most cases, not all I sadly have to say, but in most cases is done in a very quick and humane manner, which to be honest is probably more humane death for the animal than a lot of European abattoirs.
Yes, I think it's worth pointing out to anybody who objects to the idea of animal sacrifice. Well, if you eat meat, what is the difference? The animal's not sacrificed as such at the abattoir, butchery, or wherever it's killed, but it's an animal that's killed and then eaten. And as you're saying, these animals aren't just cast as okay, some parts are used for ritual purposes, but the animal body, if you like, the meat is eaten.
And also, it's not something which is done. It's usually reserved for a lot of the larger services and for specific, sort of rites within voodoo.
I just want to come back to, we're talking again about cinema experiences of voodoo. Obviously, the Bond film itself, it's just ridiculous. I mean, most mainstream Hollywood productions that do anything with magic tend to totally misrepresent things. But what do you think of the Serpent and the Rainbow film, Wade Davis's experiences?
Again, it's an interesting one in that because it was done by Wes Craven, who most people will remember from films like Nightmare on Elm Street.
Indeed.
It is rather sensationalist, but there are certain things in it which I think are very interesting and quite well done. The actual depiction of the actual making of the zombie powder, which perhaps we might need to come on to next and just explain a little bit about what the zombie is actually relatively accurate. From all that I've managed to, sort of find out, people that I've spoken to and examples that I've, sort of come across. So from that point of view, it is that there are parts of it which are accurate, but then it's let down by certain other parts which get a little bit over sensationalist. But then again, that's Hollywood for you, I'm afraid.
Absolutely, you have to make the film have those elements regardless of the original story or not. But yeah, we've mentioned a couple of times now. Another probably more famous element of voodoo is the idea of the zombie. Can you enlighten us as to what on earth they actually are?
Yes, I mean, the word zombie, I think, originally comes from a French novel that was published back in the 18th century. But as far as it being associated with voodoo, it was spoken about really first in depth within the Western world in books like W.B. Seabrook's Magic Island, which was first published in 1929, which is one of the first popular books in the West on voodoo. And then Maya Deren spoke about it later in the 50s, but a woman called Zora Hurston actually wrote a book called Voodoo Gods, which first appeared in 1938. And that published the first known photograph, or so it claimed, of a zombie, which a zombie in voodoo is supposedly a body without a soul in kind of simple terms, in which through a series of both magical incantations which are designed to remove the person's own personal spirit, their sort of little soul, if you like, and also by the application of a poison which is actually absorbed through the skin, which actually renders the body completely catatonic, and the person has no response to any kind of stimulus, to any kind of pain stimulus, but is still alive in a catatonic state and can see everything that goes on and can actually also feel everything that goes on, but cannot actually express any outward sort of signs of whatever pain they're experiencing, unfortunately. It wasn't really known how zombies were created, shall we say, or even why, until comparatively recent times. In that, we obviously were just talking about the Serpent and the Rainbow film, Andy, which is based on the Wade Davis book of the same name. And Wade Davis was an ethnobotanist who, during the 1980s, went out to Haiti to actually research the zombie poison and find out what it was all about, because it was thought that it could actually be used as an anaesthetic and save a lot of deaths on the operating table from anaesthetic shock. But the actual poison itself, which is the key part, if you like, of the making of a zombie, shall we say, is a very hit and miss affair, as Davies found out. Its practice is largely preserved within a lot of the Haitian secret societies and forms part of, I don't like the terms black magic and white magic, because as we know, they are,
as you've thought previously, magic is magic.
All magic is magic, and they don't really, sort of make sense to talk about it in terms of black and white. But such a person, most of the cases, the early cases, certainly the one that Darren photographed, have been sort of attributed to people largely with schizophrenia and mental problems. Yeah. But there is no doubt that the actual making of a physical zombie is a physical reality within Haiti. And what actually happens is, when the person is put into this catatonic state, they are then buried because they are thought to be dead, but then are actually dug up by the Hugun or Boko, sort of either the priest or the sorcerer or whoever has actually made the zombie in the first place. And then the usual story is that they are then put to work as cheap labour in the cane fields. But this is an argument which really doesn't hold water in a country where labour is actually cheap, is actually far cheaper than the actual laborious process of all of the various bits and pieces which go into making the zombie poison, which some of the actual ingredients are purely magical. They don't actually have any biological effects, such as various sort of powdered bones and things like this, which are actually put in. And also, the poisons are very hit and miss. Some poisons are so strong that they kill outright. Some poisons don't actually work at all, whereas others do actually hit the mark, and when the person is actually dug up and resuscitated by the Hugun or Boko, they are in such a state, because the oxygen has been deprived to the brain while they've been buried in the grave. There's all the trauma to be considered of what they've gone through, and most of them do not therefore make a full recovery, and are sort of reduced to a kind of a vegetable state. It's a very, very rare thing, physical zombification in Haiti, and I'll come on to astral zombies, which is something different in a moment. But physical zombification is really, as far as all the research I've managed to do and the people I've managed to speak to, it seems to be a punishment that is enacted on someone that has breached the rules of a secret society in a very severe manner. Because although a lot of the Haitian secret societies, which go under a lot of various names, Bizango, Sampuel, Zobop, there's various others, again, these sort of vary from region to region. They have a strict moral code, and if anybody breaks that moral code, sort of in the most heinous of ways, sort of by rape, murder or something else, then zombification is a punishment which may be levelled by the Boko or somebody within the society on that person, because what that does is it turns somebody who was a feared criminal into somebody that is then feared and rejected by society. Yeah, right. It is like the ultimate punishment, which is, it doesn't actually finitely kill the person, but makes them literally an outcast in their life, and therefore they become feared and rejected by society at large.
I think it's also worth mentioning, of course, there's been a couple of TV series now that talk about zombies taking over the world and The Walking Dead, etc. That's totally different, nothing to do with this whatsoever, really, because the zombie that we're talking about here doesn't start to decay before your eyes, whereas of course the zombie reanimated creature that's been brought back to life by some strange chemistry in these TV films is a very different thing.
Yes, obviously we have, sort of probably Giorgio Romero, the
Absolutely.
Italian horror director, to thank for that with, sort of films like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and I think it was Night of the Living Dead, which is the first one, which have just, sort of shown zombies as these kind of people that were actually dead and then actually reanimated, whereas obviously a physical zombie in Haiti is not somebody that has ever actually physically died. They have just been put into a catatonic state which actually mimics death. And for all intents and purposes, when they're laying on a mortuary slab, they appear dead because their bodily functions have been reduced by the poison to such a degree that they are just not detectable.
I suppose
The person is actually still alive.
Earlier times when you were relying on things like your own hearing and etc. to determine someone's state, then it's quite possible you might mistake them for being dead. Molecular science now would recognise someone's in a very deep coma state, if you like, that's catatonic, that is still alive. But we would know that modern times now, of course, whereas before you wouldn't have the ability to detect these kinds of things.
Of course, that's correct, Andy. And I mean, then as I say, I perhaps should talk about the more common form of zombies within Haiti, which is what are known as zombie astral or astral zombies, which are actual spirits where a Huguenot or Bokor, through various rituals, can actually go to the grave of somebody who has recently died, although usually tombs are left for a year following death, because to disturb them will result in what's known as the coup de l'air, which is bad air, which is something which is like a poisonous air, which is said to emit from the dead body when it's decomposing. But these tombs can be visited, and supposedly, according to tradition, the little soul of the deceased will hover around the tomb after death, and this can actually be captured by the Huguenot Bokor by taking various things from the grave and imprisoned in a container like a bottle or a calabash or something. And then it can actually be sent out and made to work for the person who has taken it on an astral level. But that is something completely different to a physical zombie. And that is something which is actually more common within Haiti than, you might think. Zombie astral are, sort of these la travail that I described. These are, sort of working spirits which can be sent, to sort of to people, to either curse them, to cure them, and for various other things. But again, I should say that there's a lot of ambiguity within voodoo, in that the same spirits can be used to kill or cure in a lot of cases. It's all down to obviously the intention of the person that calls them, which, as we know, is that applies right across, sort of European magic and sort of a lot of other traditions in the world as well.
It's a feature of what you would probably call general necromancy, is a kind of getting the spirit of the dead to do things for you.
Yes, and it is a form of necromancy, basically. Yeah, the taking of a zombie astral.
So you mentioned there was a little self for the.
Yes, traditionally there is the T-Bonage, or little guardian angel, or little self, and the Gros Bonage, which are two sort of spirits which everyone in Haiti is said to be born with. One is said to relate to the actual individual soul of the person, which is like their sort of consciousness, that what makes you, if you like.
Yes.
Whereas the other is said to be a guardian spirit, which is usually a loa, which is then revealed during the various stages of initiation which have gone through on the road to becoming a Huguenot or a Bokor, which actually is the tutelary spirit, which is something separate. That's actually like sort of your sort of link to the greater cosmos through a spirit form, which is actually, some people, sort of, but it kind of makes me laugh in that I see a lot of particularly, I don't wish to diss American voodoo here, please don't get me wrong, but I've seen a lot of white initiates in America that have been initiated in voodoo that end up revealing who their mectet, or master of the head as it's known, is, their particular tutelary loa. But to do that actually can give power to someone else who can actually use that loa against you.
That's not a good idea.
So you shouldn't actually reveal it. It's something which is usually revealed during initiation, because there are three main steps to becoming a Hugun, where you're initiated and you become a Huntsy, which is a Huntsy Bossar, which is literally an untamed horse, because a person, when they are possessed, which is the main form in which the lower manifest themselves during ceremony, they are known as horses. There's a, I won't go into the origins of that now because probably it's going to be a whole other lecture, if you like. And then they become what's known as Sao Puen, where they're under a further initiation, which is literally on the point, as it's known, which means you are on the point of becoming a Hugan or Mambo. And then from a male point of view, the final initiation is where you become Hugon Asogwe, which means you actually take the sacred rattle, which means that's the rattle which is used to call up the spirits, and also means that if that Hugon wishes, he can then start his own line or his own lineage.
Right, I mean, it's a couple of interesting features there. We're almost talking about what we, perhaps in Western magic, would call the Holy Guardian Angel you're kind of connecting with.
It is very, yes, it's a similar concept. It's a similar concept, yes.
It kind of brings you into my other realm, if you like, of course, the kind of a collective unconscious, almost as if this thing's a manifestation of an archetype. You're kind of connecting with as well.
Yes, it is. And I mean, certainly within recent years, there's been streams of what I would term loosely esoteric voodoo, which have come across out of Haiti originally. Probably the most well-known one within the West is the sort of the line started like the Couleuvre Noir, the cult of the Black Snake, which was started by Michael Berthiaud.
Yes, I was going to come on to that, funny enough, actually, the voodoo.
Which is, sort of, in all honesty, it's difficult to define the origins of that because they are on slightly shaky ground, if I'm honest, in the fact that all of the history that's known and written about and recorded is actually by Berthiaud himself, albeit under various pseudonyms. And therefore it's actually difficult to define the lineage from the guy Jean-Luc Maine, which Berthiaud said he was initiated from, much past that, in all honesty. And although it exists as a bona fide tradition now, it's really difficult to ascertain the origins of that beyond the early 20th century, even though most advocates would have you believe that it comes from the French Freemasonic lines, which do undoubtedly go back to the late 18th century.
It's interesting because it kind of comes back to last month's show. We were talking about the origins of Wicca, which got from my friend Kerry, how there is always this requirement, if you like, to have some kind of prehistory, that nothing can be just new, started recently. It has to have kind of mythical origins that you can't really trace back, that kind of links back to other organisations in the distant past. Things like the Golden Dawn did it, obviously, with their original Suffolk manuscripts supposedly found in that book, of course, reported by the market, that go back to some German organisation that never existed. Wicca, of course, with Joe Gardner meeting Dorothy Clutterbuck and these strange little rituals supposed to be going on, which doesn't really exist. George Pickingill, we've talked about before a few times now, about the misappropriation of Pickingill as being some kind of grand wizard that he may well never have been at all. So it's a common feature, isn't it, that there has to be this history that doesn't really exist.
It is, although that's only really become a feature of voodoo as it's really come to the New World. It doesn't really feature particularly in Haiti, and it certainly doesn't feature in Africa.
Oh yeah,
it's just been part of a long-standing, sort of ancestral tradition. But certainly the Berthiaud stuff is an amalgam of not just voodoo, but he also pulls in a lot of other diverse sources, such as the Japanese kami spirits, which are ancestral spirits within Japanese Shinto tradition and Taoist tradition.
And of course, one name that always leaps out to me is Koronzon.
Yes.
Completely different system taken.
Yes, of course. And obviously there is a lot of European influence now within, sort of Berthiaud's system as well, which is, as I say, come from Freemasonry largely.
Yeah, but what saying is, rather than say, hey, this is my system I've put together, no, there has to be this mythical history behind it. But that's one of those things that you do find very common. I mean, I personally think it goes back to people like Blavatsky and the idea of the ancient sort of secret chiefs providing this information, the Theosophical Society being based on this ancient mystery tradition that maybe didn't exist.
It does, and the sort of the get out here is that voodoo being primarily an oral tradition, you won't find books from hundreds of years ago detailing it, like you will a lot of the sort of books on European sort of magic and witchcraft, which obviously we know go back several hundred years, sort of medieval times, and even beyond that for sort of various herb books, which obviously stem from the Anglo-Saxon times.
Yes, of course.
But there is none of that record, I'm afraid, within voodoo, and it's really a matter of taking things on trust. I mean, my godfather's house within Jacmel, traces its lineage orally back to Martinez Pasquale and the origins of Freemasonry within Haiti. But there is no historical documentary proof to actually substantiate that, I'm afraid.
I say that the whole voodoo thing with Bertio's was for a while very popular over sort of in the West, but I think it's kind of died away a little bit as well. Because
It was,
partly because I think the fact that we recognise that so much of it is untraceable, i.e. maybe made up.
Yes, I mean, I think really Kenneth Grant was probably the guy responsible for introducing sort of Bertio's system to the West, even though obviously it pre-existed, you know, sort of Grant's publications. But he kind of saw all of the Western mysticism in it and saw the incorporation of voodoo and wrote about it a lot, and then voodoo was then picked up on via Grant by a lot of the chaos magic orders within the late 1970s and 80s when they sort of came into form, and voodoo sort of really started to take off within popularity in the West because of that. But it was a form of voodoo which is probably quite unrecognisable to its African ancestors.
Yeah, of course, and as you say, book dealer, of course, know that prior to its republication by Weiser, I think it was, the Voodoo Gnostic workbook, Bertio's main text, was going to Cilia money for a period of time, wasn't it?
It was, yes, until it was reprinted by Weiser, who supposedly did a revised and expanded edition, but then still forgot to incorporate the diagrams, which are one of the most important parts of the original text.
Supposed expanded, was actually a contracted edition of stuff missing. There's one more topic we really need to cover that, again, is in the kind of public psyche that's linked with voodoo, which is completely erroneous, and I'm sure we're going to slay that demon right now. Voodoo dolls. What would you care to say something about that?
Yes. Voodoo dolls have really kind of achieved popularity through American voodoo and hoodoo. But the voodoo dolls which are used there now to, you know, sort of everybody knows the image of putting pins in them to curse people and things like that, is not of African origin. That's purely drawn from puppets and various other forms of image magic which form a part of European magic and witchcraft. Certainly there are various fetishes used within African voodoo, and yes, within Africa there are figures called Minkisi, which are part of the Congolese tradition and elsewhere, which do actually have nails banged into them to activate them, but the form and the usage of them and the ritual surrounding them is completely different to anything to do with what is now termed voodoo, I'll put that in inverted commas, dolls, as are used in America, which, as I say, it forms no part of the religion in Haiti and forms no part of the religion in Africa. Although now, ironically, there are various dolls being used in Haiti because, as we know, all forms of transmission are never ever one way. Now there are aspects of American voodoo which have now influenced certain aspects in Haiti. So, you know, it has become part of things now, but originally it certainly was erroneous. It was just not part of it at all.
No.
And as I say, it was part purely of European tradition. And yes, there's a possibility that could have been introduced at a comparatively early stage within Haiti, because when European magic and the grimoires started to be introduced, I mean, it was largely through French grimoires originally that a lot of bocaux in Haiti from sort of the 18th and early 19th centuries would prize things like the Petit Albert and various other, you know, sort of books of so-called black magic, because, you know, they contain practical spells and folk magic.
Haiti's official language is French, isn't it?
Haiti's official language is French, although Haitian Creole is the language that most Haitians speak when they're usually amongst themselves, shall we say. And then you also have the additional difficulty, which there is a subdivision of Creole known as langue or langage, which is a magical language which is mainly based on the words of African derivation. Whereas Creole itself contains words of African, French and Portuguese derivation for the most part of its,
of course,
you know,
Congo was
construction.
Portuguese conquered, wasn't it?
It was, yes. Yeah, it was, you know, parts of the Congo, were French, and part of the parts were also Portuguese.
I understand you actually plan to make a visit yourself there to Haiti. Are you
Yes.
brushing up on your languages at the moment?
I am learning Creole at the moment, but unfortunately it's a very, very difficult language, and je ne pas comprends Creole at the moment, which is one of the phrases I've learned, which is I do not understand Creole, just in case I get into trouble. But it's my intention to go to Haiti to actually conduct some field work in various places, not just in the south of the country, but where the various forms of voodoo are perhaps preserved in a more pure form, both from a Congolese, a Nigerian and a Dahomian aspect within the north of the country. And I hope to do that next year, and obviously then the results of that will go into a book which I am writing at the moment.
Of course, absolutely. That's what we guys do, us occultists, we write books. So, but it's a long-term project, I assume. It's not going to be any time soon.
No. It's one of those projects which I've written in part, but there is no way that it can actually be finished until I've actually gone out and done field work, because there are certain corrections. Even though I've spoken to people in Haiti, people that have been initiated in Haiti that live over here and in America, there are still aspects which I need to clarify to make the book as accurate as it possibly can be.
Absolutely, and obviously not going into details at the moment, but I know there are a couple of, as you're saying, there's areas you've actually recognised that there are existing errors that are hopefully going to now be corrected, which is always an important thing.
Yes, there are. I mean, there's a lot of people that have written some great books on voodoo over the years. I mean, Maya Deren's book is, Voodoo in Haiti is an excellent book, but unfortunately she didn't recognise a lot of the true origins of a lot of the Loa as coming from the Congolese region, which is something which has only really been recognised largely within the academic fields within the past 20 years.
Yeah. These things are always developing, aren't they? Always new avenues to be explored, and often, as again, know that with occult, unfortunately, sometimes things are taken for granted as being the case, and people repeat that same error over and over again, and it kind of becomes the established position. It goes back to the basics. You find there's a mistake made. I mean, I'm not going to with my own book on Liber Coronzo about the Enochian magic. Identified a misspelling of a particular name that Bertio has made use of, and of course there are other areas of witchcraft over here that errors have been made, which I talked about briefly in our show last month about picking Gil Cunning Merrill kind of mix up. Well, that's pretty much it for today.
And rather unfortunately, my recorder started to die at that particular moment, so the very end of the show was actually lost. But it was just me saying goodbye and thank you for listening. And I'll say the same. Thank you for listening and goodbye. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with the next High Strangeness Factor show with Steve back on the helm. But for now, this is me, Andy Mercer, signing off.